What an honor it is to be with you this evening and to join you in celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Love and Fidelity Network. It really does seem like just yesterday that this wonderful organization was founded, and I want to send out special congratulations to Cassie Huff, whose vision and leadership made it a reality. It was only a couple of years before that here at Princeton that the original group that became the foundation of the Love and Fidelity Network, the Anscombe Society, was created. If I recall the circumstances correctly, it was Cassie and Sharif Girgis, who's here this evening, and Christian Sonner, who were the driving forces behind the Anscombe Society. A year later or so, Christian won a Rhodes Scholarship, Sharif won a Rhodes Scholarship, Cassie won a Simon Fellowship, and the Simon Fellowship came with some money to do some good. And Cassie decided that she would use that money to found the Love and Fidelity Network, to plant Anscombe societies, or groups modeled on the Anscombe Society at universities around the country. And what a wonderful vision that was. And so Cassie really deserves our thanks and praise this evening. And of course, she couldn't have done it without the wonderful assistance of Lisa O'Brien, the godmother of the Love and Fidelity Network, who's done so much to make all this happen. Lisa, you're here. You're going to have to stand up. And I want to thank and congratulate and welcome our new fearless leader, Elaine. Great to have Elaine with us. Caitlin LaRufa, then Caitlin Siri, who was a member of the Anscombe Society here at Princeton, and then after going off into financial services for a short time after graduating from Princeton, took over for Cassie as the leader of the Love and Fidelity Network. Brittany, who's here, Brittany Bazile. Brittany, she's over there. You guys have all just done I'm probably forgetting someone or someones, but gosh, what a fantastic job you all have done. And you really, this is a special celebration for you, this 10th anniversary celebration. I see Anna over here. So many people have been involved in making this organization a success and planting groups around the country who are doing great good. For real flesh and blood human beings who are being shown something better, something more excellent than the hookup society and the culture on the campuses that we see around the country. Ben and Jenna, thank you for being here and for being our moderators. Ben and Jenna are two of my favorite people in the world. We had them here in the Madison program last year for a year. I absolutely hated to see them go or let them go. But they're doing wonderful work down at Furman University, where they founded and lead the Tocqueville program, and we're just delighted to have them back. Thank you, Ben and Jenna. And then I want to thank my faculty colleagues. I think there's 17 faculty colleagues who are regular supporters of the Anscombe Society, co-sponsors of Anscombe Society events, and I believe of this event as well. I saw one poke his nose in. He's looking after his kids. Professor Eric Gregory from the Department of Religion, who's also the chairman of the Council on the Humanities here at Princeton. We're really blessed at Princeton to have such a, this is a small university, by the way. I mean, we're Williams pretending to be Harvard. We're a small liberal arts college masquerading as a big research university. So having that many faculty members who are out of the closet supporters of marriage and the real thing, marriage, and sexual morality or sexual integrity is a big deal, and I think it offers a real inspiration and helps to embolden and encourage, put courage in our wonderful students who exercise such leadership here on the Princeton campus. I see Ellie and Allie and some of them here this evening, and they're just absolutely inspiring, and I'm so grateful for the courage that they and my faculty colleagues exemplify. And courage is what we need. I think Ben or Jenna or both mentioned it. It is and Elaine mentioned it, is absolutely what we need. We know what the right thing to do is, don't we? We're not in a whole lot of doubt. Our problem is not fundamentally intellectual. Our problem is mustering the courage in the face of the daunting circumstances we find ourselves up against, finding the courage to stand up and speak the truth in love, but out loud. And God bless all of you. You wouldn't be here this evening unless you had that sort of courage and were willing to exemplify it and to model it for other people. So that's what we need to go back and do. If this conference does nothing else, let it further encourage you. You who already have courage, let it further encourage you. Let it deepen your courage so that you can go back and be bold witnesses and role models for your peers. Now, when I've spoken at this conference in the past, I've really focused on sexual integrity, on sexual morality, on marriage. This evening's going to be a little bit different because I am going to be talking not so much about that stuff, although I'm happy to talk about it. If you want to do a little Q&A on that, I'm very happy to. But I'm really going to be talking about the situation more broadly in universities. I'm going to be talking about liberal arts ideals and the challenges to liberal arts ideals and what we need to do to restore the basic ideals of liberal arts education. When the flower children and anti-war activists and rebels of the 60s, the 1960s, the Middle Ages to you guys, but I can just about remember them, became professors and college deans and university presidents in the 70s and 80s and 90s, they did not overthrow the idea, or at least an idea, of liberal arts education. In a great many cases, they proclaimed themselves the true partisans of liberal arts ideals. Now, it's true that many representatives of that generation in positions of influence and authority in the academy today believe that universities should be in the forefront of producing young men and women who will be social activists. More than a few seem to be eager to transform university education itself into a species of vocational training for aspiring ACLU lawyers, Planned Parenthood volunteers, and community organizers. There are indeed some colleges, perhaps some of you come from colleges, that actually offer academic credit for social activism. And I've noticed where this is the case, it has to be social activism of a certain description. Others, however, resist the idea that learning should be instrumentalized in this way. They profess allegiance to the traditional, or at least a traditional, or traditional-sounding idea that the point of liberal education is to enrich and indeed to liberate the student learner. That's what's supposed to be liberal about liberal arts learning. It's supposed to convey the knowledge and impart the intellectual habits of mind and skills and virtues that carry with them a certain profound form of personal freedom. However traditional this may sound, there is nevertheless an unbridgeable chasm between that idea of liberal arts education, the one sponsored and promoted by many in positions of influence today, and the true classical idea or ideal of liberal arts education. Many academic humanists and social scientists working in contemporary higher education propose the goal of liberal arts learning as liberation, to be sure, but the question is, liberation from what exactly? In their conception, what I will contrast with the classical understanding of liberal education and call the revisionist understanding of liberal education. In their conception, the revisionist conception, the liberation that we're supposed to get from liberal arts learning is liberation from traditional social constraints and norms of morality. The beliefs, principles, and structures by which earlier generations of Americans and people in the West more generally had been taught to govern their conduct for the sake of personal virtue and for the sake of the common good. Now, why do they regard liberation of this sort so desirable, liberation from traditional social constraints and moral norms? Because it has become a matter of dogma that the traditional norms and social structures are irrational. They are vestiges, we are told, of superstition and phobia that impede the free development of personalities by restricting people's capacities to act on their desires and thus to be true to themselves. Identifying, you notice, the self with one's desires, wants, passions. In this dogmatic context, the purpose of liberal arts learning is to undermine whatever's left of the old norms and institutions, such as the institution of marriage, as normatively conceived for just about ever. To accomplish the task, teaching and scholarship are meant either to, one, expose the texts and traditions once regarded as the intellectual treasures of our civilization, the Bible, Plato, Augustine, Dante, Aquinas, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Austen, Locke, Gibbon, the authors of the Federalist, and so forth, as mere works of propaganda meant to support or reinforce unjust, racist, sexist, classist, homophobic social orders. Or yet more insidiously, number two, to show how the old texts and traditions can be reappropriated or reinterpreted to be used as tools to subvert the allegedly unjust, racist, sexist, homophobic, etc., social orders. And beyond this, liberal arts learning is meant to enable students to become truly authentic individuals, people who are true to themselves. So here's the question. What is the self to which people are supposed to be true? What is the self to which the authentic person is true? Well, for those in the grip of this liberationist ideology, to be true to oneself is indeed to act on one's desires. Indeed, what one fundamentally is one's desires. So authenticity, that is, being true to oneself, is understood to consist in doing what you really want to do, in defiance, if necessary, of expectations based on putatively outmoded, retrograde, benighted moral ideas and social norms. Much of the talk about identity today reflects precisely this understanding, or what I would describe as a misunderstanding. I am being me when I am identifying myself with my wants, feelings, emotions, desires, and so forth. If you criticize my particular wants, feelings, emotions, desires, and so forth, you are attacking me. That's a personal assault. How dare you? So according to this conception of personal authenticity, whatever impedes one from doing what one wants to do, unless that is what one happens to want to do is in violation of some norm of political correctness. Unless that's the case, whatever impedes you from doing what you want to do is a mere hang-up, something that holds one back from being true to oneself, from being the person one truly is. Such impediments, be they religious convictions, moral ideals, or what have you, are to be transcended for the sake of the free and full development of one's personality. The very essence of liberation, as reconceived by the partisans of the revisionist conception of liberal arts education, is transcending such hang-ups by, for example, flaunting one's sexuality and acting on one's sexual desires that one might have been, quote, repressing, unquote, as a result of religious or moral convictions. Now, nowhere is this clearer, in my experience, than in freshman orientation programs in many colleges and universities around the country that feature usually compulsory events designed to undermine any lingering traditional beliefs about sexual morality and decency that the new students might bring along from home. These events are largely exercises in sexual liberationist propaganda, however much they are advertised by university officials as efforts to discourage sexual assault or unwanted pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections or bullying or what have you. Most of them, you can tell me whether this is true at your home institution, most of them are utterly one-sided. They present a particular view about sexuality, gender, marriage, and so forth, and it's not the one represented by the Love and Fidelity Network, or the Anscombe Society, or Christianity, or Orthodox Judaism, or Islam, or any of the traditional faiths. Dissenting views, such as the views that sodomy or promiscuity, fornication, are immoral and affronts to human dignity, are never aired. It would be considered outrageous if someone were to represent that view in these contexts. It would be considered an assault. You see precisely this in the efforts by the new totalitarians to shut down Love Saxa at Georgetown. No dissent will be tolerated, because any such dissent is an attack on me. You think you're challenging my ideas. You're actually impugning me. You're a bigot. The point seems to be to send the clearest possible message to students who may, perhaps because of their Christian or Orthodox Jewish background, dissent from the prevailing sexual liberationist orthodoxy, that they are outsiders who had better conform, get with the program, or keep their mouths shut. A friend of mine who a number of years ago attended Williams College tells a story that could be told by students or recent alumni of similar institutions from Bates to Pomona. Shortly after arriving at Williams, the new students were divided into small groups to discuss campus life. Each group was led by an official moderator. Attendance was compulsory. The moderator informed the students that it was important for each of them to understand sympathetically what it was like to come out as gay. The presupposition, of course, was that a person who experienced strong or dominant homosexual inclinations or desires must come out as gay in order to be true to himself, in order to be authentic. No alternative view, of course, was presented, despite the fact that belief in sexual restraint and traditional sexual morality generally, not to mention reticence concerning one's personal feelings pertaining to sex, is by no means a monopoly held by so-called straights. But let's lay that aside for now. The moderator's next move, you can predict this, was to direct each student to state his or her name and say, "I am gay." So around the table they went, with students, all too predictably, falling into line, conforming to the moderator's directive, "I'm Sarah Smith and I'm gay. I'm Seth Farber and I'm gay." When it was my friend's turn, he politely but firmly refused. He was 18 years old, but he refused. He thought about thinking for himself even before my colleagues and I sent our letter around. The moderator, of course, was shocked and demanded an explanation. With some trepidation, my, at that time, young friend replied simply by telling the truth. Quote, "This exercise is absurd and offensive and has nothing to do with the purposes for which I and others came to Williams College, namely to learn to think carefully, critically, and for ourselves," unquote. Confirming the old dictum that maybe your dad taught you, that bullies are cowards who will never stand up to people who have the temerity to stand up to them, the moderator backed off. Now, of course, what goes on in these collegiate re-education camps, masquerading as freshman orientation programs, and in far too many classrooms, is radically different from the classical understanding of what liberal arts education is supposed to accomplish. Formally, as a formality, The classical and the revisionist conception are similar. Both propose liberal arts learning as liberating. Both promise to enable the learner to achieve a greater measure of personal authenticity. But in substance, they could not be further apart. They are polar opposites. The classical understanding of the goal of liberal arts education is not to liberate us to act on our desires, but rather and precisely to liberate us from slavery to wayward desires. Personal authenticity, under the traditional account, consists in self-mastery, in placing reason in control of feeling, emotion, desire, passion, in ordering that what Ben and Jenna's great teacher, Leon Cass at the University of Chicago, recalling his own great teacher, Plato, would have talked about as the correct ordering of the soul, with reason in charge, and passion not eliminated, but under the direction of reason. According to the classical liberal arts ideal, learning promises liberation, but it is not liberation from demanding moral ideals and social norms. It is rather liberation from slavery to self. Now, how can it be liberating, you might ask, to enter into the great conversation with, say, Plato and his interlocutors, which you'll be doing if you're getting a good liberal arts education? What's freeing? What frees us when we are invited by our professors to think along with, say, Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine or Dante? Beyond being entertained by Shakespeare's charm, wit, and astonishing intellectual deftness, why should we make the effort to understand and appreciate the bard's work? According to the classic liberal arts ideal, our critical engagement with great thinkers, such as the ones I've mentioned and many more, enriches our understanding and enables us to grasp more fully great truths. Truths that, when we appropriate them and integrate them into our lives, liberate us from what is merely vulgar, coarse, or base. These are soul-shaping, indeed humanizing truths. Truths whose appreciation and secure possession elevates reason above desire or appetite, enabling us to direct our desires and our wills toward what is truly good, truly beautiful, truly worthy of human beings as possessors of profound and inherent dignity. The classical liberal arts proposition is that intellectual knowledge has a role to play in making self-transcendence possible. It can help us to understand what is good and to love the good above whatever it is we happen to desire. Glory, power, fame, wealth, social standing, sexual conquests, liberation of the sort that's worth anything, education that provides liberation of the sort that is worth anything, enables us to rise above those desires, to perceive and to seek what is truly good. And it teaches us to desire the good because it is good, thus making us truly masters of ourselves. Now, these contrasting views, the classical and revisionist views of liberal learning, of what is supposed to be liberating about it, reflects competing understandings of what human beings fundamentally are, what philosophers would call competing anthropologies. I've spoken of the soul-shaping power of truths. But on the revisionist view, there neither is nor can be any such thing as the rational soul, the thing that not only someone like Aquinas believed in, but the thing that someone like Aristotle or someone like Plato believed in. There is merely a self, a psyche. And the self is constituted not by powers of rationality that enable us to know what is humanly good and morally right and direct our desires toward it, but rather by our desires themselves. Reason's role in our conduct, on the revisionist understanding, can be nothing more than instrumental. It is not and cannot be the master of desire, but only its servant, its ingenious servant. Reason cannot tell us what to want, what's worth wanting, what's good, but only how to get, how to obtain whatever we happen to want. As David Hume, the 18th century British skeptical philosopher, articulated the claim, I quote him, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and may pretend to no office other than to serve and obey them," unquote. Now, sometimes it is suggested that it was the convention-flouting, colorful figure of Jean-Jacques Rousseau who, above all others, inspired the trend of belief that reached its full flower in the 1960s. I wonder, though, whether the greater blame, or from the opposing point of view, credit, should fall upon the staid, old, allegedly conservative, and in some ways he was conservative, David Hume. In any event, if the Humean understanding is the correct one, then the rational soul is an illusion, and belief in it and in truths that can liberate us from slavery to our desires is something not unlike a superstition. Although Hume himself did not draw the conclusion, human fulfillment, such as it is, would seem to consist not in self-mastery, not in overcoming desires that run contrary to what reason identifies as good and right, but rather in freeing ourselves from allegedly irrational inhibitions, those hang-ups that impede us from doing as we please, doing what we want. Hence the slogan that will forever stand as a sort of verbal monument to, it embarrasses me to say it, my generation, the so-called me generation. And that imbecilic slogan was, some of you of a certain age will remember it, you can say it with me, if it feels good, do it. Yeah, you're here. I'm not the only old guy. That was the slogan. The true, now contrast, the true liberal arts ideal, the classical ideal, rejects the reduction of reason to the status of desire's ingenious servant. It is an ideal rooted in the conviction that there are indeed human goods, basic aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, human flourishing. And there is indeed a common good, in light of which we have reasons, not just desires, reasons to constrain, to limit, to regulate, and even to alter, if necessary, overcome our desires. Not to be slaves to them. The classical ideal, the true ideal, proposes the study of the great works of the humanities and social sciences with a view to grasping more fully these goods and the reasons they provide, and to understanding them in their wholeness, understanding them integrally. What liberal arts truly, or what the true understanding of liberal arts offers, is an audacious hope, namely the hope that we can be masters of ourselves and not slaves to our desires. Now, can it really be true? Can it really be true? What could there be in us or about us, the mere dust of the earth, mere material? What could it be about us that could actually make it possible for human beings to be masters of their desires, feelings, emotions, passions, and not, in the end, mere slaves to them? will only this mysterious thing that Plato's Socrates was so centrally concerned about, and that so many great thinkers and writers of the Western and some of the Eastern traditions, from Plato forward, have sought to understand and tell us about, namely the soul. Soulless selves, selves without souls, mere selves, in the modern sense, could have desires and even a certain form of purely instrumental rationality directed toward achieving the efficient satisfaction of desires. But these soulless selves could never be masters of their desires. They would perpetually be what Hume thought we all are, slaves to them, in the end, ultimately. Only by virtue of our rational souls can we exercise the more than merely instrumental form of rationality that enables us, unlike brute animals, to be masters of our desires and not mere slaves to self. We may feel a bit of sadness and pity when we see the lion take down the gazelle, but we don't imagine that the lion has done anything morally wrong, because a lion is soulless. A lion lacks rational freedom. A lion is not subject to moral norms. But we, even people who've gone pretty far down the other road, still have some sense that a predator, Harvey Weinstein, who preys on a vulnerable, let's say, actress, aspiring actress, has done something morally wrong. We don't think of Harvey as just another lion taking down a gazelle. The belief in something like the rational soul still lingers. It's the ghost that won't go home. Now, of course, if you believe in such things as reasons, the consideration of which has the power to constrain desire, reasons that we have access to by virtue of our intellectual capacities, capacities that are part of an apparatus that is no mere slave of desire, but can transcend and master desire. If you believe those things, then what you are looking for, what you're trying to understand and know, are virtues. That's what you want to know. You want to know what virtues are and what virtues there are. You are seeking to answer the question, what qualities make for an honorable, worthy, upright life? What are the habits and traits of character that we should cultivate in ourselves as free and rational creatures, so to be masters of our passions rather than slaves to desire? Some years ago, the wonderful documentary filmmaker and good friend of mine, Michael Pack, and the no less wonderful historian biographer, Rick Brookhiser, visited us here in Princeton. I believe it was in this very room. And they were showing us an advanced copy, an advanced viewing of their film, their documentary film on George Washington, which has now been out for a number of years. Now, some of the students who were here were perplexed when Rick Brookhiser explained to them that Washington came to be who he was by imagining in his mind an ideal, the ideal of a truly noble person. As a young man, the future statesman and founding father of our country, formed a picture of the kind of person he would like to be, and then tried to become that person by acting the way he supposed that person would act. As Rick put it, he stepped into the role he had designed for himself. He sought to make himself virtuous by ridding himself of wayward desires or passions that would have no place in the character and life of the noble individual he sought to emulate, and by emulating, to become. Now, for someone who understands and believes in the classical liberal arts ideal, in the ideal of self-mastery, there is nothing in the least inauthentic about Washington's imagining what a virtuous person would be like and then trying to become such a person by living the virtues he embodied. On the contrary, this is an act of the most profound authenticity. Washington sought to become master of himself rather than slave to his desires. But to some of the students, not all, but some of the students in the grip of the revisionist understanding, Washington's conduct seemed the opposite of authentic. It seemed radically inauthentic to them. They responded to Rick Brookhiser by saying, Washington was play acting. He wasn't really being himself. He was trying to live a life that wasn't his own because he wasn't affirming and following his desires. Rather, he was trying to reshape his desires, of course, in line with standards drawn from, as one of them put it, outside himself. Well, yeah. Now, not all the students saw things this way, but we can explain why some of them did. They had drunk, and drunk deeply, of the Kool-Aid of the revisionist conception of what a liberal arts education is about, a conception rooted in a profoundly misguided, in my view, notion of what a person is, a soulless self governed by desires, whose liberation consists in freeing himself or being freed from constraints on those desires, be they formal or informal, external or internal. They had not so much as considered the alternative view, the view of man that is at the core of the classical conception of liberal arts learning, namely the human being as a rational and free creature, a creation capable, or a creature capable of understanding reasons for acting, in light of which he can become the practitioner of virtues that enable him to discipline his desires and become truly master of himself. Now, why had they not considered it? That would be the next question. I mean, it's not they considered it and rejected it. They'd never considered it. Why did they not consider it? Whose fault is that? It's not theirs. They hadn't considered it because it had never been presented to them as an option worth considering. That's a failure of the education they had received. They made it all the way to Princeton and well into Princeton in many cases without knowing there was an alternative conception, an alternative understanding, an alternative anthropology, an alternative understanding of who the human person is that they could at least or should at least consider. Now, the true founder of the liberal arts ideal was Socrates, at least the version of Socrates that's presented to us by his student Plato. As you know, there are some different accounts of Socrates in which he's not the hero. But the Platonic Socrates is the founder of the liberal arts ideal. And Socrates' method of teaching was to question. He's the great exemplar of what the late Alan Bloom labeled the interrogatory attitude, an attitude that even defenders of the liberal arts ideal sometimes fail to exhibit and inculcate in their students. The liberal arts ideal, the correct one, the traditional one, assumes to be sure that there are right answers to great moral and existential questions. It's the enemy, not the friend, of moral relativism. To adopt the interrogatory attitude is not to embrace moral relativism, the idea of no right answers. But liberal arts teaching is not fundamentally about telling students what the right answers are, even when we justifiably are confident that we have the right answers. I often say it is not my job to tell my students what to think. That's their job. My job is to teach them how to think more deeply, more critically, and as my friend from Williams says, for themselves. Liberal arts learning is not just about receiving and processing information, the check-the-box right answers. No. It's not about just processing information, even if it's great information, such as historical facts about the Western tradition or the American founding, vital though that is. It's not just about reading Aristotle or Chaucer or Shakespeare or Tocqueville and knowing what these great writers said and being able to report it on an exam or in a paper, or even, to some degree, analyze it. It's about something more fundamental. It's about engaging with those writers and thinkers. Indeed, it's about wrestling with them, with their ideas, with the great questions that they themselves wrestled with. It's about considering their arguments, or arguments that can be gleaned from their work or developed based on it. It's about considering the best possible lines of counterargument and examining alternative points of view. And the range of alternatives students need to be invited to consider, while not limitless — there are some genuinely idiotic ideas that you don't need to spend a lot of time with — needs to be wide, very wide. Liberal arts education is not catechism class. Nothing against catechism class. There's a place for catechism class. That is not the university classroom. Students should not simply be presented with officially approved views, even if they are the right views. I don't want my own, much as I love them, I don't want my own views presented as the officially correct views. I want my own students, for example, to consider seriously a very wide range of possibilities, including some, Marxism, for example, that I think are not only unsound, but reprehensible, and whose record in human affairs is a record of death and abomination. I certainly want them to hear the profound arguments advanced against Marxism by people like Hayek or Solzhenitsyn or John Paul II, but I also want them to understand how it was that Marxism could have attracted the allegiance of so many intelligent and even morally serious, if seriously misguided, people. And it did. I want them to know the arguments Marx and his most intelligent disciples made. In fact, I want them to consider these arguments fairly on their merits. The task of the liberal arts teacher, as I envisage it at least, is not to tell students what to think. It is indeed to teach them how to think. Now, why? Why? Is it because I think there's something intrinsically valuable about the interrogatory attitude? Alan Bloom might have thought so. I don't know. The possibility that he did is what opened him to the charge of relativism and even nihilism advanced by some culturally conservative critics of Bloom's influential work, The Closing of the American Mind. Walker Percy, for example, the writer, faulted Bloom for allegedly holding the view that the point of an open mind is merely to have an open mind, rather than to arrive at answers that are to be affirmed and acted on. Now, whether or not the charge is just, the charge, if true, would be a damning one. The idea of a mind that never closes on a truth is antithetical to the liberal arts ideal, though keeping an open mind, that is, being willing, even when one firmly believes one firmly possesses a truth, being willing to entertain counterarguments and challenges, is part of the liberal arts ideal. But the point, it seems to me, of the interrogatory attitude is precisely to move from ignorance to truth, truths that can be affirmed or acted upon, to get nearer to we'll never possess the truth fully, not in this life, but to get nearer to a complete understanding of the truth. As G.K. Chesterton once said, the point of an open mind is like the point of an open mouth, to close it on something solid. Now, we begin to understand the much misunderstood and abused concept of academic freedom when we consider the central importance of the interrogative attitude to the enterprise of liberal arts learning. The interrogative attitude will flourish only under conditions of freedom. It can be smothered by speech codes and the like, to be sure, but also in less obvious ways. It can be smothered when well-qualified scholars, teachers, and academic administrators are denied positions in institutions that claim to be nonpartisan and nonsectarian, or when they are denied tenure or promotion or are subjected to discriminatory treatment. It can be smothered by an atmosphere of political correctness. Crystal Dixon was an associate vice president of human resources at the University of Toledo. She's an African-American woman and a faithful Christian. Some years ago, she wrote a letter to the editor of her local newspaper rejecting the claim that, quote, sexual orientation, unquote, as it ambiguously has come to be called, is like race and should be included alongside race, ethnicity, sex, and the like as a category in anti-discrimination and civil rights laws. When her letter was published in the local newspaper, the president of the University of Toledo at the time, a man named Lloyd Jacobs, suspended her from her job and threatened further punishment if she did not recant and apologize for publishing a view that he evidently regarded as heretical. It's the same attitude you see on display with the critics of Love Saxa at Georgetown. And what's remarkable about that case, the Dixon case, now this case, is how unremarkable it is. Scarcely a week passes without some offense being committed by some university or its administrators or faculty or students against intellectual and academic freedom. Of course, given the strong leftward tilt and the manifest ideological imbalance at most of our nation's colleges and universities, it's almost always the case, not always, but almost always the case, that the victim of the attack is a student, professor, or member of the administrative staff who has dared to write or say something that disputes a politically correct dogma, such as the belief that there is nothing morally wrong or even questionable about homosexual conduct and that sexual orientation is akin to race. Yet all is not darkness. Shortly after the Crystal Dixon episode, the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia voted against granting tenure to a truly outstanding young scholar of family sociology that will be known to some of you in this room, Bradford Wilcox. Despite Professor Wilcox's extraordinary record of intellectual achievement and distinguished teaching, he was punished for his conservative, religious, and moral opinions, opinions which his politically correct opponents were foolish enough freely to mention in discussions prior to the vote on his application for tenure. They would have been much wiser to keep their mouths shut about that and just practice discrimination without boasting about it. Although Wilcox's tenure denial was initially upheld by university administrators, the university's then president, John T. Castine, reviewed the case and reversed the decision. Bully for him. Wilcox was granted tenure and is now a distinguished and very prominent professor of family sociology at Virginia. By rectifying a gross and manifest injustice, President Castine struck an important blow for academic freedom, and with it a blow for the interrogative attitude and the liberal arts ideal, one that sent a message not only to his own faculty at the University of Virginia, which is a good thing to do in itself, but to students and faculty and administrators at other institutions around the country. Now, as we consider the appalling behavior of one university president in Crystal Dixon's case, and the encouraging conduct of another university president in Bradford Wilcox's case, perhaps it's worth pausing to ask why we care, or should care, so much about intellectual freedom in the academy. Why ought we to be concerned about the rights of an administrator, a Crystal Dixon, who is suspended for stating her moral views in a university that says that it's morally neutral and non-sectarian, or the freedom of an assistant professor at the University of Virginia who's denied tenure because he would not toe the party line at his university? Why should we care as much as we do, or at least most of us do, about students who are punished with a bad grade for having the temerity to state a view that's out of line with those of the course's instructor? What is it about intellectual or academic freedom that makes it worth worrying about and worth fighting for? In my view, it's not, or not merely, a passion for freedom for its own sake. We want our young people, and those responsible for teaching them, to be free from repression or invidious discrimination, but we should fight for these freedoms for a reason that goes significantly beyond them. We should fight for freedom from oppression on our campuses because we believe that academic freedom is freedom for something profoundly important, namely for intellectual excellence, the excellence that makes self-mastery possible. We should struggle to destroy the oppression that is too often manifested on our campuses, resulting in the groupthink, in the conformism, in the collapse of the kind of love for truth that motivates people to question established orthodoxies. We should struggle to destroy that so that students and scholars can pursue understanding, knowledge, and truth more robustly across the arts and sciences and appropriate the great goods of human intellectual striving more fully into their lives for their own benefit and for the sake of the common good. We should honor academic freedom as a great and indispensable value because it serves the values of understanding, knowledge, and truth that are greater still. What's the point of academic freedom? It's not just freedom for its own sake. It's freedom for truth-seeking. It's freedom for the self-mastery that is made possible by love of truth and devotion to getting it. Although some have depicted freedom and truth as antithetical, in reality they are mutually supportive and indeed dependent on each other. The defense of academic freedom and the interrogative attitude it serves and supports must, implicitly at least, appeal to the concept of truth. And any plausible and complete case for academic freedom will present understanding, knowledge, and truth as intrinsic values and virtues that ground the intelligibility of freedom as something indispensable to their pursuit and meaningful appropriation. On the other side of the question, the overwhelming evidence of human history over time across continents, not to mention the plain evidence under our noses when we examine the contemporary situation in our universities, shows that freedom is necessary to the intellectual life, as necessary as oxygen is to bodily life. Now, as soon as you say the things I've said this evening, someone's going to pop up and say, yeah, but aren't there limits to academic freedom? Of course. And the legitimate scope of expression is obviously narrower in institutions that are founded on particular religious and moral principles than it is in institutions that proclaim themselves to be non-sectarian and non-partisan. But the scope of freedom, as a value that is ordered to truth, must be generous, especially in the academy, where free inquiry, exploration, and experimentation are often essential to insight and richer understanding. And that's true, by the way, even of those religious institutions. Religious institutions, too, need to be concerned about preserving academic freedom if they want to be something more than mere catechism classes, if they want to provide their students with a love of truth and a power of self-mastery. And of course, even within legitimate bounds, academic freedom can be abused. Academic freedom does not guarantee excellence or even passable scholarship or teaching. Sometimes respect for it insulates abuses from correction. But again, even though those things happen, the lessons of history and of our current situation could not be clearer. Repression of academic freedom, far from shielding us from error, undermines the very process, the very enterprise of truth-seeking. But someone might say, yeah, but there are many truths that we know, or we now know. Why must we permit them to be denied and questioned? Why not take the view that error, or at least clear error, has no rights? Otherwise, doesn't the defense of academic freedom collapse into the self-stultifying denial of the possibility of truth? Doesn't it make freedom rather than truth the ultimate academic value? Now, I've already mentioned that some partisans of academic freedom misguidedly depict truth as the enemy of freedom. They appeal to or presuppose a species of relativism or subjectivism or radical skepticism in defending freedom of inquiry. Now, it's certainly true that one reason for respecting academic freedom is that people can indeed be mistaken about what they regard, even securely regard, as true. The history of science, even science, is full, and maybe you would say especially science, is full of this. People settle on something they think is absolutely true and unquestionable, and then somebody has a new idea, a new insight, generates a new piece of evidence, and suddenly the old paradigm collapses, and we ask, how can anybody believe that? But I think that the possibility of error is not the primary or most powerful reason for honoring academic freedom and protecting it even in areas where we believe we are secure, indeed where we are secure in our knowledge of the truth. The stronger and deeper reason is that freedom is a condition for our fuller appropriation of the truth. Have you been hearing me use that word without defining it through this entire lecture? This word appropriation. I use the term because knowledge and truth have their value for human beings, their intrinsic value for human beings, precisely as fulfillments of capacities for understanding and judgment. The liberal arts are liberating of the human spirit because knowledge of truth, attained by the exercise of our rational faculties, is indeed intrinsically and not merely instrumentally valuable. Useful knowledge is, of course, all to the good, and it's wonderful when human knowledge can serve other human goods, such as health, as in the biomedical sciences, or economic efficiency and growth, or the construction of great buildings and bridges, or any of a million other worthy purposes. But even useful knowledge is often more than merely instrumentally valuable, and a great deal of knowledge that wouldn't qualify as useful in the instrumental sense is intrinsically and profoundly enriching of the human spirit and liberating. This is why we honor, rightly honor, why we should honor, and should honor even more than we do in our institutions of higher learning, excellence in the humanities and pure science, whether social or natural. Knowledge that elevates and enriches, knowledge that liberates the human spirit, cannot merely be notional. It must be appropriated, brought into our lives. It is not and cannot be merely a matter of affirming or even believing correct propositions. It cannot be check the box, even if we're correctly checking the box. The knowledge that elevates and liberates is knowledge not only that something is true, or is the case, but why and how it is the case. And typically such knowledge does more than merely settle something in one's mind. It opens new avenues of exploration. It pays off, or its payoffs include new sets of questions, new lines of inquiry. To return then to the question, why respect freedom even where truth is known securely? It's because freedom to inquire, freedom to assent or withhold one's assent, as one's best judgment dictates, is a condition of the personal appropriation of truth by the human subject, the human person, whose flourishing is what ultimately matters. And it is intrinsically valuable, not in some free-floating or abstract sense, but precisely as an aspect of the well-being and fulfillment of human beings, rational creatures whose flourishing consists in part in intellectual inquiry, understanding, and judgment, and in the practice of the virtues that make possible excellence in intellectual matters. The freedom we must defend, each and every one of us, in the domain of sexuality and integrity and in all others, the freedom we must defend is the freedom for the practice of these virtues. It is freedom for excellence, the freedom that enables us to master ourselves, to be masters of ourselves. It is a freedom that, far from being negated by rigorous standards of scholarship or morality, demands them. It is not the freedom of, if it feels good, do it. It is rather the freedom of self-transcendence, the freedom from the most abject form of slavery known to humanity, slavery to self. Thank you.